Hi everyone, welcome back to ISC Psychology. In this video, we will be covering the first three schools of thought: Structuralism, Functionalism, and Behaviourism. For your exams, pay attention to what core idea each school believed in, who the key psychologists were, and most importantly, how to write about them while answering without mixing them up. Before we get into the three schools, let me give you a quick framework for understanding what a school of thought actually is. Psychology wasn't always the subject you are studying today. At some point, a group of people had to sit down and decide, what even is psychology? What should it study, and how often should it be studied? And psychologists often disagreed on these points. A school of thought is basically a shared way of thinking about a subject. When a group of psychologists agree on what psychology should focus on and how it should be studied, they form what we call a school of thought. Now, in the early days of psychology, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, nobody had really agreed on what psychology was supposed to be studying. Was it the mind, the brain, behavior, consciousness? Everyone had a different answer. And out of that debate, these schools of thought emerged. Each one is essentially an answer to that question. Structuralism said, study the structure of the mind. Functionalism said, study what the mind does. Behaviourism said, forget the mind entirely, study behaviour you can actually observe. Three very different answers. Let's take them one by one. Structuralism is considered the very first school of thought in psychology. It was defined as the study of the structure of conscious experience by breaking it down into basic elements, and the person most associated with founding it is William Wundt. Wundt set up the first ever psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. This is actually considered the birth of psychology as a formal scientific discipline. Before this, psychology was basically philosophy. Wundt wanted to make it a proper science. Now, what did Wundt and the structuralists believe? Their core idea was this: the mind, like everything else in nature, has a structure. And if you want to understand the mind, you need to break it down into its most basic elements, the way a chemist would break down a compound into its basic elements. And the method they used to do this was introspection. Introspection was defined as systematic self-observation of one's own mental processes. Introspection literally meant looking inward. Wundt would train participants to carefully observe and report their own mental experiences, what they saw, felt, and perceived when they were exposed to some stimulus. They were basically asked to be scientists of their own minds. Participants were trained to focus on basic sensory experiences, avoid interpretation, and describe raw experience, called immediate experience. So, for example, instead of saying, "I see an apple," they would say, "I see a red color, round shape, and smooth texture." The second important psychologist associated with structuralism is Edward Michener. Michener was actually a student of Wundt's who brought these ideas to America. He is the one who gave the school its name, Structuralism. He believed the mind could be broken down into three basic elements: sensations, feelings, and images. Being one of the earliest schools of thought, structuralism had several limitations, which were addressed by the later schools. This is an important section for your exams. The most important one was the over-reliance on subjective introspection. The method was considered to be highly subjective, with different people describing the same experience differently. It lacked objectivity and could not be independently verified. Secondly, the method could not be applied to children or animals, which limited the scope of research. Finally, the school was criticized for focusing only on structure and not function. By focusing on conscious, basic elements, it disregarded the complex behaviors like language or social cognition. So, for your exams, you will need to remember names of the two psychologists with at least one relevant concept each: Wundt, first psychology lab, and introspection. Michener, name the school and three basic elements of the mind. Secondly, pay attention to structuralism's limitations. And this is important because it explains why the next school emerged. While structuralism was asking, what is the mind made of? Functionalism asked a completely different question. What does the mind do, and why does it do it? The functionalists were not interested in breaking the mind into elements. They were interested in understanding how mental processes help us adapt to our environment. In other words, what is the function of thinking, feeling, and perceiving? And here you can already see a very big influence: Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin had argued that physical traits exist because they help organisms survive. The functionalists extended this logic to the mind. Mental processes must also exist for a reason. They must serve some process in helping us survive and adapt. This school of thought also expanded the field as it studied children, animals, and people in real-world settings. The most important name associated with this school is William James. James was an American psychologist and one of the most fascinating figures in the history of psychology. He wrote a landmark book called Principles of Psychology in 1890, which was so comprehensive and well written that it shaped the field for decades. He directly challenged the structuralist view of breaking the mind into parts. James' famous concept was the stream of consciousness. He argued that the mind was not a collection of separate elements. It was a continuous, flowing stream. Consciousness does not stop and start. Instead, it flows like a river, and that idea directly challenged what the structuralists were saying. For example, right now, as you're watching this video, you're not just processing my words. You might also be feeling slightly warm, thinking about dinner, or noticing a sound outside. All of this is happening simultaneously and continuously. That is the stream of consciousness. The second psychologist associated with functionalism is John Dewey. Dewey took functionalist ideas and applied them to education. He argued that education should be practical and experience-based. Children learn best by doing, not just memorizing. That idea was so revolutionary at the time and is still relevant today. Functionalism, however, was not without its own limitations. It was criticized as being too broad and lacking clear methodology. It did not have its own systematic method, instead borrowed methods from different areas which made the field less precise and harder to study. Secondly, while reacting to structuralism, functionalism overlooked the importance of analyzing the basic elements of mental processes. For example, it explained that thinking helped problem solving, but did not analyze specific elements involved in thinking. Again, for your exams, pay attention to the two names: William James with his stream of consciousness idea, and John Dewey with his contribution to practical applied education. The key phrase that defines functionalism is this: the function or purpose of mental processes in helping organisms adapt. Make sure that function or adaptive appears in your answer. Now we come to behaviorism, and this is where things get really interesting because behaviorism was almost rebellion against everything that came before it. Both structuralism and functionalism were studying the mind. But here's the problem that behaviorists had with that. You cannot directly observe the mind. You cannot see someone's thoughts. You cannot measure consciousness. So how can you call it a science? The behaviorists argued that if psychology wanted to be a true science, it must only study things that can be directly observed and measured. And what can be directly observed? Behavior. How an organism responds to a stimulus. That's it. Everything else, thoughts, feelings, consciousness, was considered off limits. The founding figure of behaviorism is John B. Watson. In 1913, Watson published a paper called the Behaviorist Manifesto. In it, he essentially declared that psychology should abandon the study of consciousness entirely and become the science of behavior. Watson's most famous, and also controversial, demonstration was the Little Albert experiment. Let us look at this a little further. Watson conditioned a baby, known as Little Albert, to fear a white rat by pairing it with a loud, frightening noise. Albert had no fear of the rat initially, but after repeatedly hearing the loud noise whenever the rat appeared, Albert began crying at the sight of the rat alone. Watson used this to argue that emotions and behaviors are learned, conditioned responses, not something innate or mysterious. Now, this experiment would obviously be considered deeply unethical today, but in the context of the time, it was hugely influential in establishing that behavior could be scientifically studied and shaped. The second major behaviorist you need to know is B.F. Skinner. Skinner extended behaviorism further with his concept of operant conditioning, the idea that behavior is shaped by its consequences. If a behavior is followed by a reward, it's more likely to happen again. If it is followed by a punishment, it is less likely to happen. Skinner demonstrated this through experiments with rats and pigeons in what became known as the Skinner box. You will cover Skinner in much more detail when you get to the learning chapter, but for now, just know his name and the core idea. Behavior is controlled by its consequences. While behaviorism profoundly influenced psychology as we know it today, there were some important limitations. First, by focusing only on stimulus response, behaviorism ignored internal cognitive factors like memory, thinking, and problem solving, which are crucial for understanding complex human behavior. Secondly, it was criticized as oversimplifying behavior by relying on element studies and focusing solely on observable, measurable actions. Lastly, it was criticized for its passive view of learners, where learners were often treated as passive recipients of environmental stimuli, rather than active participants who process information and construct understanding. For your exam, Watson and Skinner are your two names. The key phrase for behaviorism is observable and measurable behavior. If you write those words in your answer, you're signaling to the examiner that you understand what behaviorism actually stood for. Let us now put all three together so you can see the contrast clearly, because this is where students lose marks, writing about one school but accidentally describing another. Structuralism. What is the mind made of? Method, introspection. Key figures, Wundt and Michener. Functionalism. What does the mind do? Focus on adaptation and purpose. Key figures, William James and John Dewey. Behaviorism. Forget the mind, study behavior only. Observable and measurable. Key figures, Watson and Skinner. The one question I get asked most about this chapter is how do I remember which is which? Here's a memory trick. Structuralism, think structure, think building blocks, breaking things down. For functionalism, think function, think purpose, why does it exist? For behaviorism, think behavior, what you can see and measure. A few key things to keep in mind specifically for your exam. First, the syllabus asks for 2 psychologists per school with their relevant concepts. Don't just write names for one, write the concept next to the name. So for Wundt, introspection and first psychology lab. For James, his stream of consciousness idea. Second, if you're asked to compare schools of thought, structure your answer by going through the same points for each, what they studied, how they studied it, and who the key figures were. Don't write everything for one school and then forget the others. Third, a common mistake student makes is writing Freud as a behaviorist. He was not. Freud founded psychoanalysis, which is a completely separate school you will cover in the next video. Keep that in mind. In the next video, we will move to psychoanalysis and Gestalt psychology. If you found this helpful, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to ISC Psychology and keep an eye out for the next video. See you in the next one.